Right, we have two dragon stories for you this morning. The first one, this is one of my favourite stories. This is by Bill Peake, who's quite a funny author, and he does the illustrations as well. And this is how Doofus the Dragon lost his head. It's quite a long story, so we may not have time to do, we'll do one more, and if we need to, we can catch a quick one later. Righty-ho. Once upon a time, there was a family of dragons. They were a horrible bunch of beasts who travelled about from country to country, stirring up trouble wherever they went. One day, on a trip to some faraway land, the dragon family flew into a dense fog, and Doofus, the youngest of the dragons, lost track of everyone else. Poor Doofus. Doofus kept circling about in the endless grey cloud, calling and calling in a squeaky small voice until at last he was too weary to even flap his wings. Poor Doofus. Then the little dragon gave up and went gliding down to land in a mountainside, and he crawled into a cave where he curled up in a corner to sleep for the night. Poor Doofus, he's lost everybody. Doofus awoke the next morning feeling very lonely and ever so hungry, so he left his cave to find something for breakfast. Doofus was just 4 years old, and at that age, dragons feed on small things like grasshoppers and beetles. Doesn't sound very interesting, does it? As he was searching for the tall grass near the cave, he came across a grasshopper struggling helplessly in a spider web. See the grasshopper? The spider was all set to pounce when suddenly Doofus snatched the grasshopper out of the web. For a long time, Doofus held the grasshopper by one leg, wondering what to do. How could he eat someone after he'd just saved its life? It didn't seem right, so he set the grasshopper free. After that, Doofus gave up eating grasshoppers and beetles and all other things that hopped and crept and crawled. As much as he disliked it, the young dragon took up eating grass. "It tastes awful," he said after one mouthful, "but I'll just have to get used to it." And sure enough, the more grass he ate, the better he liked it. Pretty soon, Doofus found the grass so tasty, he was stuffing it down by the handful. Don't think I'd like to eat grass. And in a surprisingly short time, the grass-eating dragon grew into a giant of a monster, a huge scaly brute with a long pointed tail and big leathery bat wings. "There's too much of me now," grumbled Doofus. "I'm one big overgrown lunk with nothing to do but eat and sleep." Then he remembered his wings. He hadn't been on a flight since he was 4 years old, the day he was lost in the fog. "Flying might be fun for a change," he said, and spreading his wings, he sailed up through the pines and then out over the countryside. It was a perfect day for flying, so sunny and clear he could make out every haystack that dotted the fields far below. He could see the cows in the meadow, the ducks in the pond, and a cart tramping along a yellow ribbon of road past the farmhouses. It would be nice to fly, wouldn't it? You'd see some really cool views. Further on, there were more roads and more houses, great clusters of houses, with a castle towering over the rooftops. It was the castle of a king, and the king was in his balcony, looking out, enjoying the beautiful morning. "Great gazookins!" he cried when he caught sight of Doofus. "A dragon! A whopper of a dragon!" And the king watched in amazement until the dragon had sailed away to disappear in the forest high on the mountainside. "What a marvellous thing it would be," he said, "to have that giant dragon's head on the wall of the great hall." And the king offered a reward of 100 golden quadruples for the dragon's head, which was a lot of money in those days. That same afternoon, every brave knight in the kingdom rode up the mountainside in search of the great dragon. Doofus was resting against a tree when the clumpety clump of horses' hooves and the clankety clank of armour reached his ears. The 2-ton dragon was much too weary from his sightseeing trip to go flying again, so he scurried back into his cave and hid. The knights were looking for a cave with bones scattered about the entrance, but if they'd gone all the way into one of them, they would have seen Doofus. Because, of course, when you go to normal dragon caves, there's bones on the outside, like there was on George. Remember George and the Dragon the other day when we read that one about the little mouse, the dragon who was scared of a mouse? After one peek into Doofus's cave, they hurried up the mountainside, peeking into all the other caves as they went. The knights searched for months, peeking into hundreds of caves, but not one of them had the look of a dragon's cave. So at last they gave up in despair. Isn't it funny how all the dragons match, the knights match their horses? I guess that means they know which horse to go back onto. The dragon's hideout would have remained a mystery if a lamb hadn't gone astray one evening. The lamb had wandered into the pine forest on the mountainside, and before long a farm boy came looking for her. Lighting the way with a lantern, the boy followed the lamb's trail. Small bits of wool had caught on the brambles here and there. When he came to a cave, he raised his lantern to peer inside. What do you think the lamb will be doing? What do you think Doofus will be doing? At first, there seemed to be nothing in the cave but rabbits. And then further on in the back, he spied a small white blob. It was the lamb, curled up beside a scaly, pointed dragon's tail. And looming up to the roof of the cave was the rest of the dragon, fast asleep and snoring. Look at him. Here, Flossie. Come on, Flossie, the boy called softly, careful not to awaken the dragon. Oh, can you hear the phone going? I've got no one in the office to answer the phone. That's right, they'll call us back. The lamb finally raised her head and then hopped to her feet and came trotting out of the cave. And the boy and the lamb went scampering away through the forest. Gosh, you'd run pretty fast, wouldn't you, when you'd seen a massive dragon like that? Halfway down the mountainside, they met the boy's father, and he was very angry. How many times must I warn you, he growled, to stay out of the woods in the dark, after dark? But I had to find Flossie, said the boy, and you'd never guess where she was. She was sleeping in a cave with a dragon. Dragon, said the father. Are you sure? A giant of a dragon, said the boy. Why, son, did you know there's a reward for the dragon's head? 100 gold quadruples. The king's knights have been searching the mountains for months. If you lead the knights to his cave, I'm sure you'll get at least part of that reward. I can't do that, said the boy. If he wouldn't hurt my lamb, then he must be a good dragon. I'll never tell anyone where he lives. That's nice. That's very kind, isn't it? With nothing to worry about and so little to do, life was getting dull for Doofus, and he decided a change of scenery might help. One day he said goodbye to his cave and took off on a trip to most anywhere. However, he picked the very worst day for flying, and before he knew it, he was caught up in a storm. He wheeled back to head for his cave, but it was too late. The fierce wind twisted his neck and tail and ripped at his wings and sent him tumbling backward into the clouds. The dragon battled the storm until his wings were tattered to shreds. Then, as helpless as a butterfly, he went whirling down out of the clouds to land on the earth with an earth-shaking kerwhump out in the fields. That would probably feel a bit like an earthquake, a massive dragon landing, wouldn't it? Doofus was so battered and bruised he couldn't move. He was one big hurt, from the point of his tail to the spikes on his nose. And as he lay there, sprawled out in the field, the storm went thundering away over the mountains. Then he heard someone shouting, "It's the dragon, the big dragon! I saw him fall!" And pretty soon a small boy came running across the field, followed by a man and a woman. It was the same boy who had found his lamb in the dragon's cave. That's pretty lucky, isn't it? "It's him all right," the boy said after one look at Doofus. "He appears to be dead," said his father. "What a pitiful big thing," said his mother. "But he's not dead," said the boy. "He just blinked an eye." "I can blink an eye," said Doofus, "but that's about all. I'm just about done for." "Are you going to tell the king," the boy said to his father, "and collect the 100 golden quadruples?" "Well, you found him, son. It's for you to decide," he said. "He's a good dragon," said the boy, "and if I take good care of him, he might get well." That's a nice, kind thing to do. So Doofus was covered with a straw stack to keep him from chilling during the night. And every day the boy brought him bunches of fresh grass and a tub of water. And every day the dragon began feeling a bit better. "What makes your father so sad?" asked Doofus one day. "Because we're so poor," said the boy. "And the reason we're poor is because of all these big rocks. They take up so much room. There's not much land left to grow anything." It looks a bit like the when you go through to Central, doesn't it, with all those rocks in Central Otago. "We've tried every which way to get rid of them, but with everyone on the farm all pushing and pulling, we just can't budge even one of these rocks." "Well, that's enough to make anyone sad," said Doofus. Early one morning, long before the first rooster crowed, Doofus burst out of the straw stack, feeling as fit as ever and just as good as new, except for his wings. They were still so badly tattered, they were useless. But the wings didn't matter, because after that awful crash landing, Doofus was through with flying. Besides, he had better things to do. Seizing the nearest boulder in his powerful claws, he jerked it off the ground and then carried it away to the far end of the field, where he dropped it. Kerblump. Oh, now that's very handy, isn't it, having a dragon that can move rocks? "Well, that was easy," said Doofus. And the next time he carried these rocks, then 4, then 5, stacking them all in one pile. When the poor farmer stepped out of the door of his cottage that morning, the land was half cleared, and he let out a whoop that could be heard for a mile. "I told you he was a good dragon," said the boy. "He's a great dragon," cried his father, tossing his hat high in the air. By noontime, Doofus had piled every last rock into one big pile. At last the land was clear, and the happy farmer hitched his donkey to a plough and set off across the field. "If that's what you call ploughing," said the dragon, "I can do that too." Jabbing his pointed tail deep into the ground, Doofus went trotting along, leaving a deep furrow and pulling up weeds and eating them as he went. That's a handy animal to have on the farm. After the ploughing was done, he helped plant the wheat. He hauled logs from the forest, and using his long, jagged tail as a saw, he cut enough firewood in one day to last the whole winter. Then he ran out of things to do. When he ran out of things to do, he stood in the wheat field with his great arms outstretched, serving as a very fine scarecrow. "He's worth a lot more than 100 quadruples," said the happy farmer. "He's worth 1,000. But the happiest of all was Doofus. At last he had become something useful, not just a big lunk of a thing. He no longer worried about the king's knights coming after him. The farm was so far out in the country, hardly anyone knew it was there. The only one to worry about was an old shepherder who lived somewhere back in the hills. Once every spring the man drove his ox cart over the bumpy road that ran past the farm on his way to the village to market his wool. The bad-tempered old fellow could be heard shouting at his oxen long before he passed by the farm. So there was plenty of time for Doofus to slip out of sight behind the barn. But one spring day, as the ox cart passed by, Doofus was careless and left his long pointy tail sticking out. The old shepherd knew very well that such a tail could only belong to a dragon. When he reached the village late in the day, the old fellow went straight to the castle and told the king. The next day, the king and his knights came riding up the road to the farm on their great war horses, armed with swords and lances. Doofus knew there was no point hiding. They had heard he was there, or they wouldn't have come. So he stood there in the field while the farmer and his son ran out to meet them. Oh, there's that phone again. We've come for the dragon, said the king, and here's your reward of 100 golden quadruples. I don't want the reward, said the farmer. The dragon is not for sale. I must have his head, said the king, so please stand aside. But he's a good dragon, said the boy. He's as tame as a kitten. He even sleeps by my bed every night. Look here, boy, growled the king. I've got no time for tomfoolery. Oh, I didn't mean all of him, said the boy. Only his head sleeps by my bed. He sticks his neck through the window and the rest of him stays outside. Well now, son, that's more like it, said the king. In fact, this gives me a great idea. I'll borrow your dragon just for special occasions and I'll pay you 20 quadruples every time. What do you say to that? It's up to the dragon, said the boy. Make it 30 quadruples, said Doofus. Then 30 it is, said the king. I wonder what they're going to do. Doofus made his first visit to the king's castle on the 8th day of April, the day of the grand spring festival. People came hurrying from miles around, crowding into the great hall, which was splendorously bedecked with banners and streamers and festoons of flowers. High up on the wall, a giant of a dragon's head appeared through an elegant window framed in gold. A happy, smiling dragon's head that brought such cries of surprise and squeals of delight and sent the crowd into a jolly, frolicsome mood. Soon they were all singing and dancing to the music of trumpets and flutes, and the spring festival was going full tilt. They were having a great time, aren't they? The dragon was so carried away by all the merriment, he suddenly burst into song with a booming, ear-splitting voice that rocked the rafters and drowned out all the trumpets and flutes before he finally caught himself. In all the excitement, Doofus the dragon had lost his head, but only for a moment. So that makes sense of the title now, doesn't it? Righto, team, we've gone over time again because I was a wee bit late to start. I'm sorry about that. So tomorrow, we're going to hear about Horton hearing a who and Horton hatching an egg. So if you've got an elephant at home, maybe you could bring an elephant tomorrow. But we'll do some Dr. Zeus. Anyway, lovely to see you all. I'm sorry I didn't chat to start with. I will see you all tomorrow.